I'd always found working as a night watchman in a cemetery to be more monotonous than scary. The silence of the night, the occasional sound of a twig snapping in the wind, and the twinkling of the stars were my usual companions. But that night, something felt different. I can't explain it, but ever since I started my shift, an uneasy feeling of heaviness had settled over me, as if the air around me had become thicker. The cemetery where I work is divided into sections, the oldest of which is nearly forgotten, with weathered tombstones and crooked trees whose roots have invaded the earth. It was a corner I rarely visited at night, but that morning something drew me there. As I walked among the graves, lit only by the dim light of my flashlight, I noticed that the atmosphere seemed to change as I approached the old area. The air felt colder despite the warm night. My flashlight flickered once, but I kept going. There was no wind, but the trees rustled softly, as if whispering to each other. I came to a particularly old tombstone. It was covered in moss, and the name carved into it was barely legible, something like João A. Ferreira, 1824-1873. I stood there for a moment, trying to decipher the words, until something strange happened. The ground around me seemed different. A very low sound reached my ears, almost like a whisper. I leaned in to listen better. I held my breath, and then I heard it breathing. It wasn't my own. It was slow, irregular, like a sigh coming from the earth. At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. I stood up quickly and took 2 steps back. I convinced myself it was the wind or perhaps some animal underground. But when I listened again, the sound was still there. It was impossible to ignore. I leaned in once more, hesitantly this time. I placed my hand on the cold surface of the grave and felt a slight vibration. It seemed impossible, but it was happening. It felt like something or someone was trapped, there trying to breathe. My heart raced, and the flashlight flickered again before going out completely. I was left in the dark, hearing only that low, steady sound, and my own heart pounding in my ears. Panicked, I got up and ran, without looking back. That night, I didn't go back to that area of the cemetery. I spent the rest of the shift in the guardhouse, feeling like something or someone was still watching me. The grave seemed alive. The next night came quickly. Despite what I had felt the night before, curiosity gnawed at me. I needed to understand what was happening in that grave. I spent the day reliving the sounds and the strange sensation I had felt. The idea of breathing. Coming from the ground seemed absurd, but I knew what I had heard. I wasn't imagining it. Around midnight I decided I would go back there, but not without preparing myself. I grabbed my portable recorder, a new flashlight, more powerful, and a pocket knife, even though I knew that it wouldn't help me if it was something truly supernatural. In my years of working at the cemetery, I had never had to deal with anything other than curious onlookers or young people trying to scare each other. But something about this grave made me feel different. The walk to the old part was longer than I remembered. The cemetery felt darker, colder. Each footstep seemed to echo louder in the silence, as if the ground itself was trying to warn me not to go any further. I ignored the discomfort and kept going. When I reached the headstone, I stopped. The place was exactly as it had been the night before. The moss-covered headstone looked even older in the light of my new flashlight. The inscription was barely legible, but I could confirm what I had seen before. João A. Ferreira, 1824-1873. I stood still, trying to calm my thoughts. After a few minutes, I decided to kneel beside the grave. I placed the recorder on the ground, turned it on, and pressed record. My flashlight was resting beside me, illuminating the headstone. I closed my eyes for a moment and concentrated. I held my breath, and then I heard it again. The breathing, it was clearer this time. Not as faint or ragged as before, but still low, like someone was having trouble breathing. My fingers were shaking, but I kept going. I leaned in closer, almost pressing my ear to the earth. The sound was there. It wasn't wind, it wasn't an animal, it was something alive. Suddenly, I felt something that made me freeze. The surface of the grave vibrated slightly beneath my hand. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. My heart raced. For a moment, I considered the possibility that some animal was trapped underground. But there was no way to explain the sound of breathing. I tried to speak, my voice coming out shaky. "Is anyone there?" Silence fell over me for a few seconds, and I thought everything had stopped. But then, as if in response, the sound changed. It was no longer just breathing. It was a long sigh, like a muffled moan coming from the depths. My mind was torn between fleeing immediately or continuing to investigate. For some reason, curiosity won out over fear. I decided to grab the flashlight and shine a closer look at the grave. It was then that I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The ground around the headstone was slightly sunken, as if it had given way. My breathing became heavy, and a feeling of nausea washed over me. Something about that grave wasn't right. Still, I couldn't pull myself away. I decided I needed to know more. I touched the grave again, but this time with more force. The moment my hand touched the cold stone, I heard a different sound, louder, a muffled groan. It was a low, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. I jumped up, and my flashlight fell to the ground, going out for a moment. In the darkness, I stood still, the recorder still running beside me. That was when I felt the presence. I can't explain it, but it felt like someone was behind me, watching. My breath caught and sweat trickled down my forehead. I grabbed the flashlight with shaking hands and turned it on quickly, turning it to illuminate my surroundings. There was nothing but the sound. It was still there. The breathing continued. I grabbed the recorder, turned it off, and started to walk away. But something made me look back one last time. The flashlight illuminated the grave for a moment, and I swear I saw the earth shift slightly, as if something was trying to get out. I ran. When I finally reached the guardhouse, I locked the door and sat down, trying to process what had just happened. The recorder was in my hand, still warm. I didn't have the courage to listen to what I had recorded that night. At least, not at that moment. In that moment, I realized that I was dealing with something far beyond my comprehension. The grave was breathing, and for the first time in years of working there, I felt like the cemetery was alive in a way it never should have been. The next night, I was determined not to return to the old cemetery area. What had happened was enough to convince me that this was not something I could or should understand. However, as the hours passed and the silence took over, a thought began to bother me. What if it was something explainable? What if it was my mind playing tricks on me? Reluctantly, I picked up the recorder from the night before and decided to listen to it. I was alone in the guardhouse, with the door locked and only the dim light of the lamp illuminating the room. I took a deep breath and pressed the play button. The recording began with the sound of light wind and gravel under my feet as I walked toward the grave. My voice came in a moment later, hesitant, calling out for someone. Then there was silence, an almost unbearable silence that lasted a few seconds, and then I heard it, breathing, slow, irregular, but audible. It was exactly as I remembered it, but hearing it again, out of context, made my heart race. The sound was human, a labored breathing, like someone trapped in a small space. I kept listening. A little later in the recording, there was the sound of something vibrating, probably the grave as I touched it. And then the groan, low, guttural, as if something was trying to speak. I turned the recorder off abruptly. I couldn't go on. As much as I wanted to run away from there, something greater than fear compelled me to seek answers. There was something in that grave that needed to be understood. I couldn't help it. I grabbed the flashlight and headed back to the old area. The path seemed even heavier that night. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound of the wind more ominous. When I reached the headstone, I stood for a moment, staring at it. The earth around it seemed even more sunken, as if it had subsided more since the last time. I took a deep breath and decided to do something I never imagined I would do. I began to dig. I used my hands and a small shovel I had brought with me. The earth was cold and damp, as if it had been recently turned over. My heart was pounding, so hard it seemed to echo in my ears. As I dug, I began to hear it again, breathing. This time it was louder, closer, but what really stopped me was feeling the earth vibrate slightly, as if something was actually moving down there. My whole body was filled with panic, but I kept going. That was when my shovel hit something solid. It felt like wood. I paused for a moment, hesitant. Was I really willing to open it? I fought back my fear and cleared the earth around the object. It was indeed a coffin. The wood was old and worn, with some parts broken, as if something had tried to get out. A feeling of nausea washed over me, but the sound of breathing was clearer than ever. It seemed to be coming from inside the coffin. I placed my shaking hands on the lid and began to force it open. The wood gave way with a loud crack, and a strong, unbearable smell filled the air. I covered my nose with my sleeve, fighting the urge to vomit, and shone my flashlight inside. What I saw inside made me immediately recoil, stumbling and falling. To the ground. The coffin was empty. There was no body, only deep marks on the inside of the wood, like scratches made by fingernails. It was impossible. The tombstone said that this person had been buried there for over a century. So, where was the body? As I tried to process what was happening, I heard something behind me, a low sound, like shuffling footsteps. My flashlight trembled in my hands as I pointed it at the location where the sound was coming from. And that's when I saw it. A figure was standing among the trees at the edge of the old area. I couldn't see its face, but it was tall and thin, with a hunched posture as if it were watching. I felt a crushing pressure in my chest, as if the air around me had disappeared. The figure took a step forward, and I finally managed to react. I ran as fast as I could, leaving the grave and the coffin behind. When I reached the guardhouse, I locked the door and threw myself on the ground, trying to catch my breath. That night, I didn't go back to the old area. I don't know what that figure was, or what happened to the body that was supposed to be in that coffin, but one thing was certain. That grave held something that didn't belong in this world. The next night, I couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. The cemetery, which had always been my place of work, safety, and routine, now felt like a living nightmare. I knew I should stay away from the old area, but something told me that if I didn't resolve this, I wouldn't find peace. I spent the day struggling with my thoughts, trying to decide whether to call someone, a priest, an investigator, or even the police. But I knew no one would believe me. Who would believe the story of a breathing grave and an empty coffin? I decided that tonight I would return for the last time. I needed answers. I prepared myself as never before. I brought a bigger shovel, my brighter flashlight, my tape recorder, and a crucifix my grandmother had given me years ago. I'm not a particularly religious person, but at that moment, any kind of protection was welcome. I arrived at the grave. Around midnight. The atmosphere was different. The air seemed heavier, almost suffocating, and the wind that normally swayed the trees was gone. The silence was absolute. I looked at the headstone, which looked even more dilapidated, as if it had aged even more in just one day. The earth around it had sunk even deeper, almost forming a small hole. It was as if something was trying to get out. My flashlight trembled in my hands as I approached. I turned on the recorder, placed it next to the grave, and took a deep breath. "If anyone is here," my voice came out low and shaky, "say something." The silence was broken by a sound. The breathing was back, louder, closer. It was so clear that it sounded like it was right next to me. My knees almost gave way, but I stood firm. That's when I heard a whisper. It was a faint but distinct sound. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a human voice, full of pain and despair. Instinctively, I backed away, but when I shone my light on the grave again, I saw something that made me freeze. The earth was moving. It wasn't a slight vibration like before. Now it was shifting, as if something was pushing from the inside out. My mind screamed to run, but my feet felt stuck to the ground. And then it happened. The earth gave way completely, and a hand appeared. A pale, thin hand with long, broken nails. It moved slowly, as if struggling to get out. My entire body was seized by panic. The only thing I could do was grab the shovel and instinctively hit the hand. The impact made the hand recoil, but the movement in the grave did not stop. The sound of breathing was now labored, desperate. The earth continued to give way, revealing more of the figure that seemed to emerge from the ground. Something was coming out. I screamed, but my scream was drowned out by the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly and saw again the figure that had watched me the night before. This time it was closer. Its silhouette was even clearer, and its eyes— yes, I could see the eyes now— were glowing a dull shade, almost like ash. The figure began to move toward me slowly and deliberately. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the flashlight. I looked at the grave and realized that the thing that was coming out was about to rise completely. Dread took hold of me. I ran, abandoning the shovel, the recorder, and even my sanity for that moment. I didn't look back, but I could hear the footsteps following me. Something was chasing me. I reached the guardhouse with my heart pounding. I locked the door and threw myself to the ground, shaking like a leaf. Outside, I heard heavy, shuffling, footsteps approaching. The figure had followed me there. For long minutes, the sound of the footsteps circled the guardhouse. The window was fogged up, but I could see a shadow moving outside. It stopped in front of the door. My heart felt like it was about to burst. Suddenly everything went silent. There were no more footsteps, no more breathing, no more whispers. The air seemed lighter. After what seemed like an eternity, I gathered enough courage to look out the window. There was no one there. That night I couldn't sleep. When the sun finally rose, I left the guardhouse and went straight to the cemetery administration. I quit my job right away. I didn't go back to get the recorder or anything else I had left in the old area. Today, months later, I still wonder what happened that night. I avoid going near the cemetery, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I feel like I can still hear that sound, the breathing echoing in my mind. I was never the same again, and now every time I see a grave I can't help but wonder how many other graves are also breathing, waiting for the right moment to open.